Oh, hey there. So recently I was in the underworld watching William Afton suffer eternal torment. It was here where I first started thinking just how dark the Five Nights at Freddy's lore really is. I mean, seriously, the series centers on a string of child murders committed by a sociopathic madman. The story exists in a bleak, oppressive world with a deeply foreboding and horrific atmosphere. That's something the games capture really well. It's not controversial to say that FNAF's atmosphere and tone are what makes the game so scary, elevating characters that wouldn't otherwise be all that terrifying. Because the atmosphere is so important, you can imagine why the FNAF movies have created some divisiveness among the fanbase. The films clearly have a brighter, more colorful visual aesthetic compared to the games, and tonally, they're a bit lighter as well, likely for broad mass appeal. They also stray dramatically from the source material in many ways. All this makes the FNAF films fundamentally different from the games. But with the movie being so different from its original source material, I can't help but wonder, was there ever an attempt to make it more faithful to the games? How do you structure a Five Nights at Freddy's movie to begin with? Well, if we were to follow the structure of the first two games, then there would be a security guard, presumably the protagonist of the movie. We then set the film at a Freddy Fazbear's location, either a literal one-to-one recreation as seen in the first two games, or a completely original one. We then have the animatronics as the main antagonists of the story, hunting the protagonist down. We could also have William Afton as the main antagonist, but if we're trying to stay faithful to the game structure, it doesn't make sense for him to be present. Now you have the basic characters and locations in place. What's harder is creating a general plot that does not fall apart. Like, for example, what reason does the security guard have to keep coming back after the first night? In the game, that doesn't really need an explanation. However, when it comes to a film, the agency of the protagonist is important. Does he have a daughter he must take care of, and this is the only job he can get? Or does he have a personal financial reason to keep coming back? How are we gonna possibly make a compelling story when it's set in one location? And finally, what must be done to have the animatronics feel like a consistent threat to the protagonist? We can't exactly have a film where the animatronics simply walk to the door and then are shut out. I can't imagine that's very interesting. Now, to those who have no experience writing, the structure of Five Nights at Freddy's seems simple enough. I mean, it wouldn't be the first film primarily set in one location. But it does become a bit more complicated once we have to factor in the lore of Five Nights at Freddy's into the equation. Those familiar with the series know how convoluted and complex the lore of this universe can be.
Was that the bite of 87?
And this is just from the available games. We haven't even factored in the books. Though granted, the books do exist in a different continuity. The thing about Five Nights at Freddy's lore is that the story isn't fully present in one title, just pieces of a wider narrative that fit into a larger saga, and because of how cryptic the story really is, it's pretty hard to pull off in a film that has to follow a traditional 3-act structure. So, if we can't adapt the games as they are, then we have to create an original story that just borrows elements from the games. And that's exactly what happened when the film was initially being developed. The FNAF movie has been in development ever since 2015, and over the course of that time, about 10 versions of the film have been developed, and each story is radically different from each other. One of the first versions of the movie was called the F screenplay. It explored a group of teenagers breaking into Freddy Fazbear's, only to uncover a deeper conspiracy within the building, such as a large underground lab where the animatronics were being produced for the US government. The Plushies Take Manhattan script explored well, plushies taking over Manhattan, but it's not really clear what this means. The Random Charlie script explored a group of kids, specifically Charlie, breaking into Freddy Fazbear's to retrieve some kind of toy. Despite the name, Charlie is not related to the character from the Five Nights at Freddy's lore. In fact, this version of the film was more of a loose adaptation of the series, which Scott did not resonate with. The Silver Eyes script is an interesting one. It was a direct adaptation of the Five Nights at Freddy's Silver Eyes book. Scott and book writer Kira Braid Risley both worked on various versions of this movie for about a year. However, due to their inexperience writing movie scripts, it was decided that sticking to the game's story was much more beneficial. The pawn shop script explored a kid who watched over a pawn shop whose life is thrown into disarray when an animatronic is brought to the store after Freddy Fazbear's is robbed. When the other animatronics come to retrieve it from the shop, adventure ensues. The Cassidy screenplay was more of an anthology than anything. It followed the story of Cassidy, but was set within multiple time periods and explored many characters. It's basically what would happen if a die-hard fan decided to cram as much of the series lore into a film as they possibly could. While interesting, ultimately the convoluted nature of the story is why it never took off. The Misfit Kid script explored a mother and son who just moved into a new town. The kid then comes across the old Freddy Fazbear's location and is roped into a horror-filled adventure. The problem with the script is that there was not many ways to explain why the kid kept going back to the location, and thus Scott decided against this version of the movie. The Ghost Trackers script explored a group of ghost hunters who break into Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. A pretty simple setup that does explain well why they are there. A problem arose, however, regarding how exactly the characters would be personally tied or connected with the location. Ultimately, none of the characters had a very compelling relationship with the restaurant. The Insane script is similar to the previous script in the sense that it followed ghost hunters once again. However, this time, the villains were the fun-time animatronics. Supposedly, the script was much more of an action-centric film, so Scott felt that it moved away from the vibe of the series too much. The Mike script was the last screenplay we were told about. Scott stated that it was the best balance of all the previous scripts he had encountered thus far. Now, based on the movie scripts, it's clear that none of the ideas ever seriously considered making the film simply follow a security guard trying to survive 5 nights at Freddy's. That's likely because there's no logical way to explain why someone would not quit after the first night. There's also the possibility that the FNAF movies were designed for mass appeal, meaning they would not be low-budget horror films that would have benefited the game structure.